Julia Meek Gaar, world traveler, philanthropist, and founder of the Wayne County Historical Museum in Richmond, Indiana, died on June 23, 1944, at the age of 85. When Julia moved to Richmond in 1882, she was a spirited girl from Ottumwa, Iowa, who had just married a son of one of the town's most prosperous families. As a young Victorian woman of means, Julia could have expected a conventional life of leisure with an indulgent husband. But things changed. Julia's father, James G. Meek, was born in Richmond in 1833 and moved to Newton, Iowa, where he practiced law, then worked as a banker. After a bank failure where he repaid depositors 100% of their money, he moved to Ottumwa, Iowa, and opened a successful dry goods store. James married Mary J. Bradley in 1857 and seems to have been an attentive father to Julia, born in 1859, and son Walter, born in 1864. Julia is shown here between her brother and her father. This photo shows teenage Julia on the right in the dark dress, elaborately coiffed, and wearing earrings and a pendant. Julia was admired and supported by both her parents. In a letter to her son written December 12, 1880, Mary tells about one of Julia's fundraising events. Julia got up a Mother Goose operetta which came off Saturday afternoon for children. They made $25 from it. They practiced it at our house day and night. Here, Julia sits on the floor in the middle of a circle of friends. In the same letter to Walter, Mary describes another of Julia's events and writes, "You should have seen the Peak sisters perform. Julia was one of them. There were 10, and they had on tall peaked hats, nearly a yard high. Everybody laughed and laughed. I guess they will clear about $300. Early on, Julia showed skill in organizing and fundraising and a penchant for costumes and drama. Since Julia's father, James, was born in Richmond, the family made trips from Iowa to visit relatives and friends in Richmond. It was during one of those trips that Julia met the man she would marry, the man who would change her life profoundly. The object of Julia's attention was William Wallace Gaar, known as Will. Will was the older son of John Milton, or J.M. Gaar, and his second wife, Helen Rattray Gaar. J.M. Gaar was a community leader and treasurer of the family business, Gaar, Scott and Company. At the time, Gaar, Scott and Company was the leading manufacturer of threshing machines and steam engines in the country. The company employed as many as 1,200 people and at one point shipped more than 12 railroad cars of threshers and steam engines twice a week. The behemoth threshers, initially pulled by horses and later powered by steam engines, made life easier for farmers around the world. This 1909 Gaar Scott catalog shows some of the branch locations scattered across the country. The back of the catalog references an export department in New York and a location in Buenos Aires. Early on, handsome Will Gaar seems to have led a carefree life. A newspaper article from September 2, 1880, with the headline, "Baptized," gives insight into young Will's life not captured elsewhere. A number of the Richmond boys who went over to Milton last Tuesday evening took part in a performance not on the program. They went on the railroad as far as Cambridge, and from there down to Milton in wagons. In order to catch up with the other wagons, the driver of the big team whipped up and had his horses going at a lively run when the wagon upset and spilled the boys into the bed of the raging Kapal, raging mostly with tadpoles as the mud was deeper than the water. Will Gaar is listed as one who fell into the mud. He walked back to Cambridge City. The nature of the newspaper articles tracking Will changed from the exploits of a young man to his approaching marriage. An article dated May 5, 1882 reads, "Very handsome invitations are out for the marriage of Will Gaar to an Ottumwa, Iowa lady. They are elegantly printed from steel and read, Mr. and Mrs. James G. Meek desire your presence at the marriage ceremony of their daughter, Julia, to Mr. William W. Gaar, Tuesday evening, May 16th, at half after 8 o'clock, Congregational Church, Ottumwa, Iowa, 1882. An article reprinted from the Ottumwa Courier in June of 1882 bears the headline, "Wedding in High Life, Marriage of Will Gaar to Miss Meek of Ottumwa, Iowa." The marriage was described as the most notable event of the season. The article goes on to say that the bride received a large number of rich and valuable presents, and we hope that we may be pardoned in mentioning that the bride's mother contributed a solid silver tea set of 6 pieces, and her father a grand upright piano. The father and mother of the groom, sets of solid silver tea and tablespoons, soup ladle, carving knife and fork, dinner and dessert knives of 76 pieces, the knives all having mother-of-pearl handles. The groom's present to the bride was a crescent with 7 diamonds and a central star. The newlyweds traveled from Ottumwa to Richmond, and an article from the June 9, 1882 paper with the headline, "The Gaar Reception," chronicles their arrival. The reception to Mr. and Mrs. Will Gaar, the residence of the groom's parents last evening, was one of the most magnificent parties ever occurring in Richmond. The mansion was elegantly decorated with flowers and clinging vines, and every nook and corner filled with blossoms. Connor's orchestra furnished the music in their usual elegant style. The guests were received by Mr. and Mrs. Gaar, who introduced Will and his bride, who was dressed elegantly in a cream satin and moire combination. Her jewels were diamonds, and beautiful ones. The picture here shows J. M. Gaar and his family on the porch of the house. After this auspicious beginning, the young couple settled down in Richmond. An 1882 Untitled clipping from a Richmond paper says, in part, "The young couple, on returning from an Eastern tour, will make their home at the Huntington House, where the groom has furnished a suite of rooms in very sumptuous style." The Huntington House was located at the southeast corner of 7th and Main. It was torn down after explosions damaged downtown Richmond in 1968. 20 buildings in the area of the explosion at 6th and Main were condemned because of the damage. Most Gaar family members bought or built grand houses in Richmond, but Will and Julia did not. From the Huntington House, they went to a duplex at 129 North 11th Street, where they spent the rest of the years they lived together. The Palladium Item building now stands where Will and Julia's duplex was located. Later, Julia Meek Gaar resided at the Westcott Hotel for many years. The Westcott was located at 10th and Main, across from the Murray Theater. With the arrival of Interstate 70, the Westcott, once a premier hotel, declined. It was closed in 1976 and was torn down in 1977 to make way for a parking lot. After his marriage, Will continued to work in the family business. In a photo showing Gaar, Scott and Company's office men, Will Gaar is shown second from right in the back row. Will's uncle, Abram, is in the front row center, and Will's father, J.M., is in the front row second from right. Later photographs of Gaar Scott officers show many of the same people in the earlier photo, but Will Gaar is not among them. Will's name returns to the news in April of 1883 as follows. Will Gaar appears to be unusually businesslike of late, though very well suited with life, apparently. This is caused, no doubt, by his increased responsibilities in the shape of a fine new boy. Indeed, Julia gave birth to her only child, James Milton Gaar, on April 21st, 1883 in Richmond, a little less than a year after her wedding day. Young James had asthma and bronchial conditions that troubled him much of his life. Richmond city directories helped track Will and Julia after their marriage. City directories endeavored to list adult residents in town for a given year. In addition to listing a person's name and address, occupations such as blacksmith, tanner, and cabinet maker appear after some names. Will Gaar's name first appears in 1878 when, at age 21, he is listed as a bookkeeper for Gaar, Scott and Company, living with his parents at 126 North 5th Street. The 1883 directory shows that Will has moved to 129 North 11th, and Julia's name appears after his, reflecting their marriage in 1882. The couple remains on North 11th until the 1901-1902 directory, when neither Will nor Julia's name appears. The 1903-1904 directory is significant because Julia is shown boarding at the Westcott, and there is no reference to Will that year or ever again. Many of the 1890 census records were lost in a fire, but the 1900 census shows that Will is listed as a 42-year-old patient at Mill Creek in Hamilton, Ohio. The 1910 census and the 1920 census show Will as a patient and inmate, respectively, of the Cincinnati Sanitarium located in College Hill. An old ad for the Cincinnati Sanitarium, established in 1873, describes the facility as a strictly modern hospital, fully equipped for the scientific treatment of nervous and mental conditions. William Mosgard died on August 25, 1928. He was 71 and had apparently been hospitalized for nearly 30 years. A brief obituary indicated that services at Mrs. J.G. Leeds' house and burial at Earlham were private. The only photograph found showing Will and Julia together may have been taken at the Cincinnati Sanitarium. Will is seated and looking at the camera, and Julia, standing behind him, is looking away from him, away from the camera. She is not smiling. Julia was in her early 40s when Will was hospitalized. She was left with a teenage son who had health problems and more than half her life ahead of her. Will's father, John Milton Gaar, who died in 1900, acknowledged his son's long illness in his will and provided generously for Will, Julia, and their son James. J.M.'s will reads, in part,
"My son, William W. Gaar, has been afflicted with sickness and compelled to abstain from giving personal attention to his business, and has been at great expense for medical treatment, and for his own support and the support and maintenance of his family, and I have paid for him and for his medical treatment, and for the support and maintenance of himself and family, sums of money from time to time, and may have to pay more. I desire that no account shall be taken of any such sums of money paid by me for him or his family as above stated, but that any and all claims in my favor on account thereof shall be forever cancelled and forgiven."
The will included additional money and assets which enabled Julia and James M. Gaar to be financially independent for the rest of their lives. In short, John Milton Gaar helped to provide for Will, Julia, and James during his life and after his death. With Will in a sanitarium and unable to support and care for her, Julia had a choice. She could have chosen to live the quiet life that might have been expected of a woman in her circumstances, staying close to home, family, and friends. Instead, Julia filled her life with a wide range of causes and interests, some of which were unusual for a woman of her era. In ways, She was ahead of her time. Organizations to which Julia Meek Gaar belonged included the Associated Clubs of Domestic Science, Daughters of the American Revolution, Colonial Dames of America, the Folklore Society of Indiana, Forest Hills Country Club, St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and the Tourists. One of Julia's early causes was the Associated Clubs of Domestic Science, started at the Union League Club in Chicago by a small group of women in 1908. The purposes of the club were to discuss conditions in the American household, to consider the distress among poor people, and to debate the subjects of household economy in general. Julia Meek Gaar was the group's first president. Julia Meek Gaar's name and picture appeared in papers as she gave advice on domestic science. There are thousands of women in Chicago and New York who order the entire food supply over the telephone or through the cook. They never think of inquiring whether the milk is pure or the canned foods have adulterants in them. An ironic message from a woman who lived much of her adult life in a hotel and often ate out. Julia was also a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR. In order to be considered for membership in the DAR, a woman has to prove lineal bloodline descent from some ancestor who helped to win America's independence. A newspaper article entitled "DAR will endorse Mrs. Gaar's candidacy for national office," dated October 17, 1916, reads, "Mrs. Gaar is one of the most active workers of the DAR in Indiana and has been signally honored by the national organization." This April 20th, 1894 photo shows Julia as part of a group called the Tourists. The Tourist organization started in 1890 and continues today. The group has described itself as the oldest continuous private social club in Richmond. Initially, many members were armchair travelers who wrote about and discussed travel. The club focused on a different country every year and learned from reports written by members. There was also discussion on a designated topic. Julia's travel, however, was not limited to the armchair kind. Her obituary says that she made 7 trips abroad and spent several years in Europe. She had photos taken to commemorate her trips. In India, she sits front and center at the Taj Mahal. Now we see Julia Meek Gaar on the right with friends dressed in a kimono. This picture of Julia in an ox-drawn cart was taken in St. Augustine, Florida. A small parasol adorns the head of the ox. This dramatic certificate showing Neptune, the Roman god of the sea, driving a team of horses documents Julia's participation in an around-the-world cruise on the Hamburg American Line ship, the SS Cleveland, in 1912. It can be argued that Julia Meek Gaar's travels led to her most important accomplishment, the creation of the Wayne County Historical Museum. When people travel, they often enjoy bringing home souvenirs, and Julia did everything in grand style. First, she kept her souvenirs and collections in her rooms at the Westcott, but soon needed more space. When Ella Bond Johnston, a founder of the Art Association of Richmond, invited Julia Meek Gaar to display some of her collections in the art gallery at Richmond's Morton High School, Julia accepted. But eventually, Julia needed more space and had to find yet another location. In her notes archived at the Wayne County Historical Museum, Julia writes that she negotiated to acquire the Whitewater Monthly Meeting of Friends Meeting House located at 1150 North A Street. On March 24, 1929, the meeting gave the meeting house to the Wayne County Historical Society for use as a museum. In addition, the Friends sold the land to the Society for $25,000. Julia goes on to write, "After acquiring this property, 4.5 months were spent in renovating it, installing 2 furnaces presented to us by the First Methodist Church, rewiring the building, installing new lighting fixtures, painting, etc. The Wayne County Historical Museum opened to the public on August 13, 1929. At last, Julia Meek Gaar had room for her collections. She became the unpaid director of the museum in 1930 at the age of 71. She would hold the position until her death 14 years later. The museum would continue to grow under her direction. By 1936, she was proposing that a new wing in Pioneer Village be added. She already had items for the space, including one from her son. James, always proud of his mother's role at the museum, contributed a polar bear skin to her collection. The skin is in storage at the museum today. James grew up to serve as a major in a field artillery unit in Germany with the Army of Occupation after World War I. After the war, James was a farmer in New Mexico. Later, he moved to the Pass in Manitoba, Canada, where he died in 1945. He never married, and no evidence was found that he ever worked for his family's business. Like James's rug, most of the other items Julia Meek Gaar acquired found their way into cases and displays at the museum for the education of the general public. One of her most famous acquisitions was a mummy. In her notes, Julia tells how she saw the mummy case with the mummy inside at the firm of E. Hatoun in Cairo on her 1929 trip to Egypt. The mummy was estimated to be about 3,300 years old. She purchased the case and the mummy and asked that they be sent to Richmond before she left on a trip down the Nile. However, upon her return to Cairo, she found that the Bureau of Antiquities had refused to release the mummy for shipment. Julia Meek Gaar contacted the American minister in Egypt, who contacted the State Department. The mummy was finally shipped in response to a request from sitting President Herbert Hoover and arrived in Richmond in 1930. The mummy is believed to be the last, or one of the last, mummies to have been removed from Egypt legally. In addition to the mummy and other large items, Julia bought quantities of small items locally. Items purchased from the Tracy Clark sale in 1930 included, among other things, one ring from Brittany, one ivory and wood stick from Africa, and a pair of Chinese shoes. Items purchased from Mrs. Lou Wallace in Wilmington, Ohio included a wine set for $4.25, hobnail glass for $1, and a honey jar for 75 cents. The museum flourished under Julia Meek Gaar's leadership, and she was its most ardent advocate. She spoke to countless groups about the museum and wrote a column called Museum Notes in the Palladium item for years. And of course, she kept acquiring items. As museum director, Julia expected every school class in Wayne County to visit the museum 4 times each year. Julia Meek Gaar's influence on the museum was so pervasive that in 1940 the Wayne County Commissioners, in a special resolution delivered in her presence, unanimously voted to rename the museum the Julia Meek Gaar Wayne County Historical Museum. Toward the end of her life, Julia commissioned a portrait by Indiana artist Wayman Adams because, as Lucille Moorhead wrote, she did not care to go down in history of her pet project with no other likeness of herself than an early tintype or a cabinet photograph of the gay 90s, or even by a present-day photographic print, that is, tinted by hand. Wayman Adams' portrait of Julia hangs in a prominent location in the museum today. Julia Meek Gaar died on June 23, 1944. Her obituary in the Palladium Item and Sun Telegram on June 24th says she died in Reed Hospital after a short illness. But oral history from people who lived in Richmond at the time tells a different story. The story is that Julia Meek Gaar had walked from the Westcott to a restaurant, probably Robert H. Dugranrut's, near the southwest corner of 11th and Main, for dinner. The restaurant had once been owned by Walter Adelot and Robert de Granrut, and some remember it just as Adelot's. When nearby patrons noticed that Julia was not moving, they investigated and found that she was dead. Her father-in-law, John Milton Gaar, who had provided for her for much of her adult life, provided for her in death. She was buried in John Milton Gaar's family plot in Earlham Cemetery. Julia would be proud of the Wayne County Historical Museum today, and she would be pleased to learn that current director Jim Harlan is planning to expand again. So much of what Julia Meek Gaar wrote was in her official capacity as museum director or in an official capacity for other organizations to which she belonged. Little personal insight into Julia was found in the material she and others left to the museum. One exception is a brief recollection given to the museum by family friend Frances Hyatt Forster in 1988. She wrote,
Julia belonged to my grandmother's bridge group. They always met twice a month, and Julia was a permanent member, always attending when she was home. She was always dressed up, and always wore 2 or 3 strands of pearls and perhaps some gold bracelets. My grandmother informed me that Julia's long pearl necklaces were real. By the time I was a senior in high school, Aunt Julia had me visiting her rooms in the Westcott Hotel. I worked with 3x5 recipe cards on which I wrote the description of the many things she had in her apartment. These were things she was giving to the museum. Many smaller items whose value she thought wouldn't be realized unless it was attached and written down. We did this for several months, and it stopped when I left for Indiana University. This completes my memories of Julia Meek Gaar. She was really just a warm, loving family friend who contributed greatly to the heritage of Richmond before we really knew she was doing it.